Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jamison Cable, and I'm with Steve Phan, the Chief of Interpretation at Camp Nelson National Monument in Nicholasville, Kentucky. Mr. Phan, how you doing?
Jameson, I'm doing well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here and to chat with you. And I guess, like many, we're connected by the one and only Stuart Sanders. So I know he's going to hear this at some point. And thanks for all that you do, Stuart. We appreciate you. So now I look forward to chatting with you about this new unit of the National Park Service and our development of this very, very important site. So again, a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, we appreciate you coming on, and we always like some Civil War. Everybody tends to like some Civil War history, so it never gets old. Well, I guess it does get old because it's history, but it gets older. But before we get too much into that, just tell us a little bit about your Kentucky connection and your background.
Sure. I work for the National Park Service. As you mentioned, I'm the chief of interpretation. So, like, kind of the lead interpretive ranger for our site now, as you mentioned, in Jessamine County in Nicholasville. And it's one of the newest units of the National Park Service. It was a county park. I think some people might know that for about 20 years. From 1998 to 2018, it was known as Camp Nelson Heritage Park, managed by Jessamine County. And they did incredible work there for not only 20 years as the park was being established, but even like a decade and almost 2 decades before that, and preserving the grounds, acquiring land there, doing archaeology, and establishing this new county park, which in late October of 2018 was declared a national monument, one of the newest units of the National Park Service. We call it the National Park System. And so if you think about Kentucky, Jameson, I think most people would think of Mammoth Cave National Park. Of course, it's an iconic site, one of the big, what we call national park sites. But we also manage a lot of other sites as well, historic sites we call them also cultural sites, like Abraham Lincoln Birthplace National Historical Park. And now we've got Camp Nelson National Monument, another Civil War site, Mill Springs Battlefield National Monument. Big South Fork National River Recreation Area. That is also a national park site as well. So when we were established, we were number 418. The Park Service system is currently, and this literally just evolved over the past couple of weeks, we're now up to 428 units. Wow. And so you can imagine, we're relatively new. And I say we're new that, as I mentioned, it was a county park for about 20 years, but us being on the ground there, it's really only been over the past few years with uniformed staff managing it as a national park site. And that's what brought me out here. I spent the past about 5 years or so working and living in Washington, D.C., working for the National Park Service. I'm trained as a Civil War historian. I actually went to a place pretty close to here. I went to Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro, and I wanted to be close to a national battlefield park where Stones River is at, Stones River National Battlefield. So I spent some time there. But I worked for this pretty unique regional program called the Civil War Defenses of Washington, all the fortification sites that were established to protect the Capitol during the Civil War. So spent about 4 years there, in total 5 years in D.C., and as I mentioned before we started recording, I had this opportunity to come out to Kentucky and build a new national park site. And so that's why I'm here. It's a great opportunity. Got the promotion, which is nice, but it's really Camp Nelson's very complex and unique story that really has brought me out here. And you can imagine for MPS staff, we come from all different places, right? So
Mhm.
the superintendent came from a park in New Mexico. He spent most of his career at Appomattox in Virginia. We have our facility manager came from Andrew Johnson National Historic Site.
Mm.
He's worked at the Great Smoky Mountains as well. Our lead park ranger, who just started right before Thanksgiving, actually, she came from Canyonlands National Park. Before that, you might have heard of the park. She worked at some place called Yellowstone, and so it's actually quite a transient career.
Yeah,
But I've been in Kentucky permanently since September of 2021, so over 2 years now, and it's been great to be here.
yeah. Now you say Yellowstone, you mean the TV show?
Yes, indeed. Well, when that's that's already one of the most popular, iconic sites. I mean, people
Mhm.
know about Yellowstone across the world, right?
Yeah.
And even more so now. I mean, visitation's already in the millions, and from what I hear from friends that work there, they get a lot of questions about the show Yellowstone, so not a surprise.
Yeah. Well, the biggest question, 'cause and you mentioned this, you're talking about the county running. What what kinda changes when it becomes a national park versus before? Yeah,
Yeah,
what's
that's
the
really
benefits?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think national recognition, it talks about the national significance. Obviously, we're talking about Kentucky history here
Mhm,
um, as a Civil War site, but the impact of what happened at Camp Nelson is nationally significant. Hence why, I know there were people that were working with the county and supporting the county park for years that was hoping one day that it would become a unit of the National Park Service. So, uh, I think when it comes down like to policy and things like that, our funding is different, of course. You
mhm.
know, we pay for the park, right? The parks are funded by federal taxpayers, so we want people to understand that this is your park as just as much as it is our park, because we work there, of course, but um, and then you start understanding the national impact, pun intended, of the National Park Service, right?
Mhm.
People want to come and visit the national parks. Um, People plan their trips around visiting national park sites, right? People come and get their stamps and they do the junior ranger booklet and they want to knock off another number off the list. As I said, I guess we're adding sites every year, but we're up to over 400 sites now, right? And so I've met people recently, I guess as of 2 years ago, that have visited all. When we had 424 sites, they visited all of them, and we're talking, Jameson, like Guam and the Virgin Islands, right?
Oh,
And
wow.
all those sites in Alaska. Like you have to plan to go out there, right?
Yeah.
And it's not an easy feat to go out to these sites. And so um, we have seen people across the country now that are making their way through Kentucky, right, and
Mhm.
are visiting these sites. So, and I see a Civil War corridor there. You as a historian and as a native Kentucky, I'm sure you see this. This is kind of a there's a Civil War heritage here that I don't think that is a lot of the Civil War enthusiasts don't often think of Kentucky when they think of the
Oh,
Civil
yeah.
War, and I think that's starting to change, right?
Mhm.
Obviously, Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis were born here. There were some major battles here, and we know of Richmond and Perryville and Munfordville and some of these other sites. John Hunt Morgan with his raids throughout the state. Um, and we've got, now two sites that are national sites with us in Mill Springs Battlefield National Monument. So it's becoming um, really kind of this go-to site, I think, for Civil War enthusiasts, and then
Mhm.
also people that want to go and see the national park sites as well. And I live in Lexington. A lot of us that work at the park live around the area in Central Kentucky, and I think there's a ton just a ton of history out here, right? And
There
it's
is.
really really exciting. And so you might have heard the concept like bourbon and battlefields, right? You can really do both in Kentucky, obviously,
Mhm.
and then other historic sites as well. And so yeah, the this becoming a national park site, I think, was a big deal, and it was a culmination of decades of work at truly the grassroots level, right?
Yeah.
And I know I'm speaking to people that have been involved with Camp Nelson literally since the late 1980s. This was a big deal for them, right? And
Mhm.
we're just here to build on the foundation that was constructed, and we feel it. It's a mission, right? And I know we think about it. every single day when we're at work, right? And we've got a
Hmm.
very dynamic team, and it's a challenge, but it's a good challenge as well, right? And it's something that we take very seriously at the park, and we're very proud of the work we're doing, and working with community members, descendants, and a lot of other organizations and partners to help to further develop this site.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, you mentioned the hotbed, I guess, of Civil War history right here in Kentucky, and you mentioned Mill Springs. So you go to Pulaski County, up you just go straight up north. You can go through Perryville and then up to uh, Nicholasville, and then you could just make a quick, easy stop, and see so much Civil War history within 100 miles of each other. I mean,
Absolutely,
it's not
and
far at all.
you can take it all the way up north to the Covington area. There's still
Mhm.
some fortifications constructed to protect Cincinnati during the Civil War, and obviously crossing the Ohio River, you might be in another state, but it's all interconnected, right?
Yeah.
And that actually is a part of Camp Nelson's development. And I guess the other big thing about Camp Nelson that actually makes it a very unique Civil War site, it's not a battlefield. And so, battles come and go, as we know, armies come and go. Richmond and Perryville, the armies are around for a short amount of time, right?
Yeah.
Maybe a week or maybe a couple weeks. Camp Nelson, as a military base, as a U.S. Army base, was in service for over 3 years, and so there was a lot that happened there. There was a lot of people that had crossed paths there. I call it the crossroads.
Mhm.
It's really the intersection of unionism. There's slavery that's involved, the complexities of slavery and emancipation. There's U.S. military campaigns. There's a refugee crisis. Um, that's a part of this site as well. So there's civilians there, there's refugees, there's soldiers, and this falls into the backdrop of Kentucky during the Civil War. As you know, a very complex site, right? A pro-union but also pro-slavery state, and you see that kind of play out in at Camp Nelson over the course of its service during the Civil War, and it actually remains in service. I mean, or at least semi-active, at least with people still being there until 1866. So even a year after the Civil War, Camp Nelson is still active.
Yeah. And we had Robert Bell on.
Yes,
I mean, it's probably been a few years now.
sure.
And he talked about the gosh, what infantry was it that he's
United States Colored Troops, the USCT.
yes. Was it is it artillery? It was
Yeah,
artillery, not infantry.
he's a descendant of the 12th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery.
Mhm.
But Camp Nelson is a large recruitment center and training center for U.S. soldiers. Starting in 1863, it was I call it a forward operating base, which is still a term the U.S. military still uses, right? It was an advanced outpost, and it becomes a concentration point for the Army of the Ohio under General Ambrose Burnside, who was placed in command of the Department of the Ohio, which includes most of the state of Kentucky as well. And this is I talk about politics and war, right? And that's in many ways that's why Camp Nelson is created in 1863, late April of 1863. It really starts being developed in the summer of 1863, but we just have to look south. East Tennessee is pro-union.
Mhm.
It's been under kind of Confederate control. There's been Confederate occupation of that area really since 1861. Andrew Johnson, the future vice president of the United States, and then president after Lincoln was assassinated, as we know. But he's the only Southern senator that stays loyal to the Union, right? And it's a big
Mhm.
deal. And during the war, he becomes the military governor of Tennessee after Nashville falls in February of 1862. But he's been pressing Lincoln in the War Department as early as 1861 to what he calls liberate the region, liberate East
Mhm.
Tennessee, liberate these Unionists, right? It doesn't happen in 1861. It does not happen in 1862. Uh, but it happens in 1863. And one of the reasons is the biggest reason is because of Camp Nelson. So it's
Mhm.
established just a few miles south of Nicholasville, right off what now we called it a US 27, the Nicholasville Road. The historic road was called the Lexington Danville Turnpike, just north of the Kentucky River.
Mhm.
And they build this burgeoning U.S. military supply depot. And it does its job, right? It will fuel his army of over 20,000 men with horses and cannons and supplies and munitions, obviously, a lot of food. And we actually commemorated the event this past August with the 160th anniversary of the Knoxville campaign or East Tennessee campaign,
Hmm.
which which is literally launched from Camp Nelson on August 16th, 1863. And within a month, the Army marches right down the road. They bypass Cumberland Gap and go into East Tennessee, and they liberate Knoxville and the surrounding area. It's a really, really big deal. Um, but and we'll be doing the 1864 and significance and anniversaries of the Civil War this next year in 2024. Camp Nelson is almost shut down and abandoned, actually.
Oh.
Because Army offensives are going to go deep into Georgia now and then up through the Carolinas, and there's really no need to continue to have this military supply depot in central Kentucky. But that all changes. You mentioned Robert Bell, and one of his descendants. There were thousands of others. Everything changes in Kentucky in 1864 when the Army starts enlisting African American men for military service.
Hmm.
It's kind of the seminal moment for Kentucky in many ways because it's the end of slavery. By enlisting in the U.S. military and what these regiments, they were known as United States Colored Troops. There were 8 regiments organized at Camp Nelson. There were dozens organized around the state. Almost 24,000 Black Kentuckians enlist in the U.S. military in Kentucky, and it starts in 1864. A
Hmm.
lot of the other states actually started in 1863, but you see this mass movement of people, and over 10,000 will enlist in regiments at Camp Nelson. Most of these men will be enslaved,
Hmm.
and so they will, they will self-emancipate, we call it, by joining the U.S. military. So you see this, right? The end of slavery, and it's you can imagine it's very controversial in the state. Lincoln has been very cautious about implementing any sort of policy that would impact the state of Kentucky because it's a loyal slave state.
Hmm.
But everything changes in 1864. Lincoln's up for re-election. A lot of war weariness going on, and I make the analogy that Lincoln and his advisors, his cabinet, they're pushing all the chips in the center of the table, right? And so if that means I have to kind of renege on my promises of not touching the institution of slavery in Kentucky, I'm going to do it because we have to win this war, right? And that's where you're going to see the significance of Camp Nelson and some other military installations around the state. But Camp Nelson is by far the largest African American recruitment center and the most impactful as well.
Hmm. And it's interesting too, like and maybe being a national park that's going to help change it and so forth. But growing up, it was one of those things we drove by it, but I never really knew much about it, I guess.
Sure.
And hopefully, it be becoming a national a park can really kind of shed some light on things because
Yeah.
it
And
doesn't.
I'd mention one of the things that we're really focusing on is kind of branding, right? Is so
Mhm.
for people to understand that a lot of people think we're the National Cemetery, Camp Nelson National Cemetery, and we're actually not. The cemetery um, is managed by the Department of Veteran Affairs. Obviously, Camp Nelson National Monument is part of the Department of the Interior National Park Service. Um, and if you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense why people would be confused by that. The cemetery has been there since 1860. Well, it was established as a national cemetery in 1866, and it's still an active cemetery. It's actually expanding, right?
Mhm.
And I know I was at Reefs Across America there yesterday. I met a lot of people who have family members buried there, right? And so you can imagine how important it is to the community and people across multiple generations. But we are historically linked. There was a cemetery there during the Civil War, and it was a part of Camp Nelson. The Army called it Camp Nelson, but the better description, it's an Army base. It's really that big. It's up to 4,000 acres by the end of the Civil War, right? Massive, with running water that's being pumped up from the Kentucky River. Over 300 wooden structures will be designed and built to support military operations, and then this growing um, crisis with refugees. Both Black and white refugees will arrive at Camp Nelson during the Civil War. Uh, but yeah, it was called Graveyard Number Two, and it was located in the southern section of Camp Nelson. Right across the road was a hospital. You can imagine there was a lot of death at Camp Nelson. There
Yeah.
were refugees and soldiers there, civilians working there as well. And so, if you go out to the historic section of the cemetery, and as I mentioned, I was there yesterday, you'll see headstones that just say civilian on there. And I was explaining it to some visitors, just people I was talking to. I'm like, those are the people that worked at Camp Nelson and died during the Civil War. They were allowed to be buried there because it was not a national cemetery. So only after the Civil War does the federal government declare it as a national cemetery, and then U.S. soldiers from Perryville, Richmond, Covington, other areas, during in Kentucky, where you'll see bodies disinterred and remains disinterred and moved to this new national cemetery. So, if you think about it, even as a county site, it's only been around for 20 plus years, right? And if you
Yeah.
compare that to almost 160 years now, that's when people think of the National Cemetery or think of Camp Nelson, they think of the National Cemetery. So that's been one of the major things we've been focusing on. There's also like a Camp Nelson campground on the Kentucky River. So we've had people call about that as well, And so, getting signage up on the road was a big deal from us on the highway, right? Like directional
Mhm.
signage that separates us from the cemetery was a big deal. And yeah, I think as you mentioned, just that people know that there's a national parks site in your backyard, right, in the middle of central Kentucky is a big deal.
Yeah, yeah, and, driving distance from, I mean, just about anywhere. I mean, even Louisville, you could get there, hour and a half or so. Um,
Exactly.
but yeah, it is interesting the significance, and which I'm biased about Kentucky history. I feel like there's a lot of significant Kentucky history that um, plays a role nationally. Um,
Absolutely.
but yeah, what exact or what do you have going on new? I guess in this coming year that people might want to come and check out.
Yeah, that's a great question. As I mentioned, it's really, and I know we were talking about the Jameson right before we started recording. Uh, the National Park Service is relatively new to Camp Nelson, right? It was established in late 2018, but there was a 3-year process where the site was being co-managed by the Park Service and the county,
Hmm.
as the park was getting more staff, a bigger budget, and things like that. And I was working temporarily, as I mentioned, for 120 days in early January, and it was still, obviously, we're still going through COVID. At one point, there was only 4 of us at the park.
Cool.
That was it, and 2 of us were there temporarily because I had to go back to Washington D.C. after 4 months, and my job was literally to hire staff, right? To hire a park ranger, to hire interns. We had some volunteers that wanted to be at the park, and uh, the park really opened for the first time, or reopened for the first time as a national park site in June of 21. So it's only been a couple years, right? When we had the visitor center open, where we're recording statistics, and our focus over the first couple years was just to maintain operations, right? Hopefully get a bigger budget, which we did get. That was a big deal for us. And then we're almost fully staffed now, and now we're working on really big projects for the park. I think both Jameson, short and long term, right? And
Yeah.
so started doing some public programs, sunset programs. By the way, it's a no fee park, right? So Camp
Hmm.
Nelson, the grounds are open 7 days a week. There's about 5 miles of trails right now. That will expand to about 10 miles in the coming years, right?
Hmm.
So you're going to really see this park develop. And so visitors can come whenever they want. Sunrise to sunset is when the park grounds are open. Currently, the visitor center, I call it the off season, right? So really, winter, fall, winter, into the springtime, we're open 5 days a week, Wednesday through Sunday, 9 to 5 p.m. There's a museum. There's a brand new park store that we got established there that I got opened there in January of this past year. That was a big deal for us.
Hmm.
Museum exhibits. We have a reconstructed barracks, which features soldiers exhibits and really tells you the individual stories of people that were at Camp Nelson during the Civil War. And then some of the things that people might not see, working on projects for the historic White House. I think a lot of people drive by Camp Nelson and they'll see that big kind of White House on the hill.
Hmm.
That house was a civilian property, and it was built like in 1855, 56, and it's obviously predated the Civil War. It's the only surviving structure from the Civil War era that's still at Camp Nelson that survived, right? It's in really really rough shape, as you can imagine, over the past 150 or so years. So we're working on a historic structures report on it right now to kind of, which provides the complete history of the site, ownership, alterations, things like that. But it also, we're looking at the foundation right now, the roof, some of the walls are caving in, things like that, right? With the goal to get the recommendations and write projects to basically repair and rehabilitate the building, which we can open to the public one day, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a really big focus for us. We're hoping within the next few years the house will be open with interpretive exhibits and guided tours and things like that. So yeah, that's just one project right there, right across the road actually from our main park area. We have about 7 acres
Hmm.
on the west side of US 27. That's where the Home for Called Refugees was established in 1865, and it's what it was. Just like what the name says, it was a place where African American refugees escaping slavery could find sanctuary, right? So
Hmm.
um, I know you've heard of Berea College and perhaps Mr. John G. Fee.
Yeah.
John G. Fee was on site at Camp Nelson during the war, and he helped establish schools there and it provided religious services and was instrumental in getting property purchased there, which was sold to the former refugees. And so there was an African American community that was formed after the Civil War. There are still descendants that live there. So you can imagine it's really,
Wow.
really
Yeah.
deep, right? Camp Nelson means a lot to a lot of different people. We have 7 acres over there right now, Jameson,
Hmm.
including the Fee Memorial Church, which we believe is the second church that was established in the area from the early 1900s. The church is in really rough shape right now. The historic structure report on that is done. And so, working on getting projects funded to repair that building, get a parking lot over there. There's no parking over there either, right? So you can see there's like foundational things that we're looking at doing right now. Um, and I share a lot of this stuff on our Facebook and Instagram pages. So I tell the listeners, just look up Camp Nelson National Monument, look up the MPS Arrowhead, and you can see
Hmm.
all the updates that we're doing. As simple as installing a snake rail fence along the road frontage, which was done literally like a week ago,
Yeah.
and that's a big deal, right? And when you go
I
out to
noticed it.
Perryville, yeah, exactly. When you go out to Perryville and Richmond, and you go to any Civil War site, when you see these fences, you're like, okay, I'm at a historic site, I think,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so getting that done, we had this really great American conservation experience group of young people, like 18 to 24, to come out for about a month straight and work on it, and it looks incredible. And I'll share with you, there was a visitor that came in the other day, and she's like, I knew I was at a historic site because I saw the fence, and I'm like, oh my gosh, so that was a big deal for us, right? We're rebuilding one of the forts that the county had actually reconstructed back in the late 2000s. I'm sorry, late 90s, early 2000s. Repairing all the wood out there. It's an earthwork made out of earth and wood. But I'm getting a gigantic Civil War cannon put out there by March
Awesome.
of 24, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess one of the big things we want to do there is I call restore the historic landscape, right? So when
Yeah.
you go out to Camp Nelson, you've seen it. It's like a pastoral landscape, right? It's
Hmm.
very beautiful out there, but we want people to know, this was an industrial kind of powerhouse for the U.S. military during the Civil War. So we're going to try to restore it back to the 1860s as much as possible. So
Hmm.
we just redid the outside of the visitor center with kind of rough looking wood. So the previous out exterior was like 50 shades of gray, we called it. It was kind of all over the place, right? So getting that was a big deal. And then I know this has kind of been a long reply, but moving forward into 24, we'll be focusing on 1864.